Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Welcome to a brand new series on how to get great mixes for your songs. In this series, we'll be exploring a wide range of topics that'll help you get better mixes of your songs, and we also want to address some of your questions. So if you have questions about creating mixes, be sure to post them in the comments below. We all know that a song's mix can make or break it. No matter how much time you spend creating and capturing the perfect tracks, if the mix doesn't deliver, then it just won't matter. The song won't sound great. Now, mixing should also be a highly creative process where you're enhancing the tracks, bringing them together, and making the entire production coalesce as a whole. To begin, before I dive deeper into my 5 tips for mixing today, let's run through some of the sort of standard things that are essential for mixing, and we'll probably dive deeper into some of these later in this series. But these include things like taking frequent breaks to rest your ears. Organize your tracks before you start. Color code similar instruments and vocals. Get the editing finished and out of the way before you start mixing. Always mix at a consistent volume level. You should use a meter to set that level, and then maintain that level as the tracks get pushed up louder. Use familiar tracks as a reference for comparison against your mix. These are all those sort of standard things that you always see as tips for mixing. But with that said, let's look at 5 of my favorite tips for creating a great mix today. Some of these will make sense for you, maybe some won't, but I encourage you to give them all a try and see how you might apply them to your own mixes. My first tip is listen first. I'm always surprised at how many people skip this vital step. So many people seem to start mixing before they've really even heard the song and the tracks. Careful listening before you start mixing will tell you what you need to do, what needs to be fixed, where you can enhance the production, where there might be problems, and lots more. Part of the problem is that a lot of us are mixing our own songs or songs that we recorded, so we think we know them well. And in many cases, we're sort of mixing as we're going along while we're tracking and editing tracks. And that's all well and good and may result in a good mix. But before you decide to go with your, we'll call it an in-progress mix or a rough mix that you inherited, I encourage you to put fresh ears on the tracks. What I recommend is stripping everything down so you're just hearing the raw tracks. Remove or bypass any plugins that might be in the mix, pull all the faders down, disable automation, ungroup, unbus tracks. What you're after is all the tracks playing directly through the stereo output with no processing, nothing in between. Now bring up all the faders to 0. Play the song. Start working your way through track by track, listening to what each track is doing in the mix. Why is it there? What's its role? What is it contributing? Really get to know the tracks well. In addition to getting to know the tracks intimately, listening should also give you a direction or a concept for the mix. What style of mix is it? Is it a performance? Or is it a painting or sculpture? Those are kind of 2 different approaches to mixing. What drives the song? What are the anchor elements that bring it all together and give you a foundation? What's the lead or the spotlight instrument or vocal? Ideally, you'll end up with sort of a map of what the focus should be at each different section of the song. What sort of environment should you create for the tracks? Do you want it to be in a room, or do you want each individual track to have its own space? It's so much easier to create a mix when you have a target or a goal in mind. So by listening carefully, the mix will tell you what it needs to be. My second tip is be careful of overprocessing. I see a lot of mixes where there are 4, 5, or even more plugins on each track, and I'm always amazed by this. When I look deeper, I find that there's an EQ doing one thing, followed by another EQ undoing what the first plugin is doing. And I get it, in the heat of the moment, you apply a plugin, then later you want to change the sound, so you apply another plugin, and so on, and so on, and so on. But if the tracks were well captured in the first place, you'll find that processing after the fact, what's sometimes called fixing it in the mix, will be much lighter. And anytime you're applying a plugin, you should have a good reason for doing so. What are you fixing? What will the plugin do to enhance things? Ask yourself, if the plugin isn't fixing or enhancing, why is it there? I think a lot of times we apply processing almost out of habit. We read about great engineers using compressors on instruments, so we do the same and we just automatically reach for a particular plugin for each instrument. But the key to using EQs and compressors well is to turn the habit thing on its head. Again, listen to the track first. If you need to fix something about it, what plugin will do the best job for you? Which means you really need to learn what your tools do and what they're capable of. To me, this sort of goes against the idea of using mixing templates and using presets. I've often done both of those things in the past and it can work well, but lately I've been trying to get away from templates and presets. Rather, I'm trying to use my ears as my #1 tool when mixing. This seems obvious, but in the heat of mixing, we don't always remember to listen first and then consciously decide what to do without relying on habits or preconceptions about what will work. So definitely apply those ears, then apply the processing, and be careful of processing your processors. My third tip was really a game changer for me, and that's to start your mix in mono. Of course, you're going to end up with a stereo mix at the end, but starting out in mono gives you some real advantages. And I've had the pleasure of talking to and interviewing a lot of the legendary recording engineers, and I was surprised how many of those great engineers, people I really respect, start their mixes and do a lot of their work in mono before spreading things out in stereo. The idea is if you can get all the tracks to stack, layer, and work well in mono, then when you spread the mix out in stereo, it will sound even better, more spacious, more cohesive, and more euphonic. Working in mono is especially revealing when it comes to instruments fighting in the same frequency range. For example, the kick and the bass need to peacefully coexist and work together in the low frequencies. Putting them in mono can really help you hear the relationship between those instruments. Even more so, guitars, keyboards, pads, and things that are typically spread out across the stereo field still all need to work together in the mids. And again, hearing that in mono can really help you sort things out. And of course, there needs to be space for the vocal or the lead instrument to be heard in the midst of everything else. And if you can get that to happen in mono, then the mix will be even better in stereo. As a side benefit, you'll easily be able to hear if there are any phase issues in the mix if you're listening in mono. My fourth tip is to avoid mastering while you're mixing. This sounds kind of funny, but a lot of people are doing this, and I've done it myself. I frequently encounter mixes where there's heavy processing on the stereo bus and the mix engineer mixed into that processing. There's always a lot of talk about using a certain compressor to glue a mix together. Or maybe an engineer will always put an EQ on the stereo bus to boost the highs so they don't need to be boosted as much on the individual tracks. And the thought process can also be that processing inserted into the stereo bus can affect the perception and levels of the individual tracks in the mix. That's all well and good, and it's certainly all true, but I recommend being conservative here. I don't tend to mix with much on the stereo bus until later in the process. I prefer to leave heavier processing for the mastering stage when I or the mastering engineer can listen with fresh ears. And speaking of mastering, sort of a sub-tip here, if you will, is to always leave plenty of headroom on your stereo output for the mastering engineer to work. If you deliver a mix that's heavily compressed and limited and sitting right below peak level, there's not much mastering can do without turning your mix down first. Instead, mix to a target level that's 6 to 10 dB below max, so there's always plenty of room for EQ, compression, limiting, and other mastering processing without fear of overload. My fifth tip is sort of a broad one, and that's to manage your mix. By this I mean a few different things. One is that at any given time there will be something in the mix that will have the focus, and pretty much everything else will support that focus item. It might be the lead vocal, a solo, a fill, a particular sound or effect, or whatever it might be in the mix. But the danger is that everything wants to be louder than everything else, and for a certain style that might be fine, just keep turning things up. But for a more nuanced mix, some things will need to drop back either in volume or in placement using ambience and delay, and some things may need to drop out entirely for certain sections of the song. Likewise, not everything can sound huge in a mix. It sounds strange, but something will only sound huge in a mix in comparison to something that isn't huge, if that makes any sense. So an obvious example is if you have a huge kick drum, a huge bass, and a huge bass synth, they're going to fight one another and the end result will sound smaller and probably muddy and messy. Rather, carve out a space for each instrument in your mix using EQ, dynamics processing, and stereo placement to get them to peacefully work together and support one another. Another example is, say, if you have a huge vocal and you also try to inject a huge sounding guitar fill between the vocal phrases. The effect will be to make the vocal sound smaller because the guitar also sounds big. But if you have a huge vocal, smaller sounding guitar, you're going to maintain the size of that vocal. So there you have it, 5 tips for mixing. And today's installment basically is more concepts rather than specifics. I mean, I'm not talking about compressing the bass by 4 dB with a side chain on the mids sort of things. We're talking more about concepts. And the reason is that mixing should be a creative art form. I believe that by keeping the overall concepts in mind, the specifics will take care of themselves because you're working to fulfill the concept or the concepts. I keep coming back to that idea of having a target, but that's really the essential takeaway. The other thing that I want to really stress today is use your ears more than your tools. It helps to have a huge palette of tools to choose from, but they're only effective if your ears are really listening to what's happening in your mix. I hope you've enjoyed this installment of our new series on how to get great sounding mixes. Be sure to leave your questions below. I'd love to answer them in future installments from this series. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Click here for more videos like this, or start at sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs.